Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this first event today, a conversation about carbon capture as a service. We are less than 30 days away from the climate change conference, and there is a lot of debate about industrial decarbonization. 2021 has already seen a lot of action, a lot of commitments, a lot of talk about net zero and how net zero could be achieved in different time frame, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Today, I'm here and I'm very privileged to be joined by two individuals who are leading in their own companies in their own way, who are leading and are helping towards the net zero ambition as far as industrial decarbonization is concerned. I'd like to welcome Helena Anderson, co-founder and chief operating officer of Ikigai Capital, and Siri Hoven, investment manager from Equinor.
Thank you.
My name is Aniruddha Sharma. I'm co-founder and CEO of Carbon Clean Solutions, and really excited to be here with all of you. Thank you for joining today. I'll probably just start with introductions and open the floor a bit for all three of us to actually just quickly introduce ourselves. Helena, do you want to go first?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much for the introduction, Annie, and for inviting me onto the panel. Ikigai is a net zero bankability consultancy, and what we focus on when it comes to CCUS is working with industrial zones, cities and districts on how they can solve their carbon emission issues across a variety of different industries. So we often work with core infrastructure, water, waste, airports and ports, and other foundational industries within industrial zones to help them not only understand what is the right path to decarbonisation, but also how are they going to finance it in a bankable way. So that may be on balance sheet, but more and more we're seeing opportunities for financing off balance sheet or interesting financing models that I know we're going to talk about today.
Super. Siri?
Yeah, hi everybody, and thank you for the introduction. I'm Siri Hoven. I represent Equinor, and I work in Equinor's venture investment unit, and I'm here as an investment manager. We invest in startups that support Equinor's strategic direction and net zero ambition, and one of our investments is Carbon Clean. So naturally linking into today's session, I think that through this session and the discussion, you will find a natural fit between our activity and Carbon Clean's activity within the carbon capture as a service space. We focus very much on transportation and storage. I'll get back to that later. But it's very important with the focus also on the carbon capturing side, which, as most of you probably know, is about 70% of the cost associated with carbon capture and storage. So the prime driver for investing in Carbon Clean from our side was to work on getting down the cost of the whole value chain. So we are now very excited to hear that you are about to launch the next generation technology, Aniruddha. So this is going to be a very important milestone for, I think, the whole industry to see the cost of carbon capturing coming down through this.
Thank you, Siri. And I actually heard quite a few important words there, which actually come out in conversation with real industry, which is cost. 70% of the cost sits in capture. I heard about bankability. So Helena mentioned about bankability and how that's super important for industries and for investors to actually come together on a common platform. Carbon Clean Solutions is a global leader in providing cost-effective technology for capturing carbon dioxide from the heavy industry. We truly and genuinely believe that the heavy industry is under massive pressure and will remain a massive pressure for a considerable amount of time in their ambition to achieve net zero. Heavy industry, particularly steel, cement, energy from waste, petrochemicals and chemicals, they particularly face a set of challenges, which are a couple of them are very little space. I mean, these are cramped facilities. They've been built over decades, and there is very, very little space available, and real estate comes at a huge premium. So whenever you start thinking and talking about decarbonization, carbon capture, the first question is, oh, how much space is this thing going to take? The second question that I've heard quite a lot is about the cost. What is this going to cost? It's a highly competitive world out there, and margins are pretty thin today, especially given where the energy prices are, and these spikes sort of keep coming. So when you're thinking about a 10-year time horizon, a 15-year time horizon, you have to think about, okay, well, where are my energy costs, or where will be my energy costs in next couple of years? And a third conversation I've always had with the industry is about financing, how financing could be linked, and how this could be provided at scale. And this is all about sort of getting things done at scale. So carbon clean solutions, Siri already sort of hinted towards that. We're working on a technology and deploying it commercially that will reduce the size of carbon capture equipment by 10 times, so that you can fit it all on one scale, you can fit it all on one box, and hence mass produce them. And once you start mass producing them, you can achieve a certain cost of carbon capture, even at smaller scale, without really worrying about, achieving 1 million tons per year of carbon dioxide capture to achieve a scale. So we truly believe that to be able to solve this cost problem and space problem, we need a mass scale up plan, a bit like Tesla type model, where you skid mount it, you put everything inside a box, and you mass produce it so that you can then deploy this and supply the technology to the industrial users globally. We've currently got 40 operating units today on the ground. Last one we started last month with Tata Steel, where we are looking to help them capture carbon dioxide and then utilize that carbon dioxide on site to produce a product. So again, very, very important project out there. And in my conversation with various industry, a common theme that always comes out is, what's the time frame we should be planning towards? Are we thinking about 100% decarbonization for a specific site in 2021, 22, 23, 25, 26? Throw in the government competition and cluster sequencing, it becomes even more complicated as to what should you be planning for as you sort of progress in different bucket times or 2-year capital cycles. So from our perspective, we are again looking to provide the technology, which is all sort of skid mounted modular box. It'll come in a box, which will allow the industrial units to successively build towards decarbonization. So you're going to start with 10% carbon dioxide capture in 2023, ramp it up to 25% in 2025, ramp it up another 25% by 2027, and then sort of go from there. And that should allow you to space your capital out, but at the same point of time, allow you to sort of bring in the learnings from the first phase and then build them on for the next phase, so that you can achieve further cost reductions as you go forward. I mean, there's enough about the carbon clean and what we're doing. I think it's quite clear that to be able to achieve a certain cost of carbon capture, you also need a couple of other elements to work, which is strategic partnerships across supply chain. I mean, how would this CO2 be moved from the capture sites to the storage site? You would also need to think about how these projects could be financed, especially the storage element of it could be financed. And frankly, is there even enough storage capacity out there? I mean, what if all the carbon capture projects come together and there is not enough storage capacity? So let me go over to Siri here and ask, start with a question here. See, how is Equinor enabling this transition, and what are the ambitions you're working on?
Well, Equinor has been working on preparing this transition for decades already. So we many years ago we set up a carbon capture technology center at our Mongstad refinery in Norway. So that's a large scale testing facility where we basically can test any capture technology before it enters the market. So Carbon Clean has obviously also been there, but again, for Equinor, we applied capture technology to several of our processing and production facilities already 25 years ago. So we have decades of operational experience in capturing and storing this carbon subsurface. And now we are really entering a new phase. So we have been working for the last few years on on a project called Northern Light or Longship now, where we set up a transportation and storage facility in Norway, offering this to third parties. So it's not only a technical demonstration project, it's also a commercial demonstration project. So really that we set up a system where we are able to offer transportation and storage by ship to customers in Northwest Europe, where they can just get rid of their CO2 as long as they're close to a port then for a tariff. So that's the first step. It's coming on stream, I think, in 2024. That's the plan. But then that's just the first. We're also having a long list of projects, some major projects also in the UK on the East Coast. And then we're scaling up gradually together with partners and together with the governments towards 2035. I think our ambition is about 35 million tons per year storage capacity at that time frame.
Exactly. I mean, this is very interesting, Siri. I mean, and I'm sure the audience here is now able to sort of start to put the pieces together, which is, Carbon Clean could essentially bring in capture as a service. Equinor here is developing options and opportunities to transport and store as a service. However, the key question still remains, and that's really where I come to Helena, which is how does the financing for these assets work? I mean, and given that you're advising clients, you're actually working with people today on the ground, what are the challenges that you see in terms of financing these types of business models?
Where to start? You raised a very important point, Annie, earlier about timing. And my answer when I'm asked that by industry, by waste management companies, by FWs, by biomass plants, when should we do this? Don't we need to wait for the government to bring in the legislation and the regulatory regimes to support permanent storage offshore? We shouldn't really do anything until then, right? And my answer is always, you need to move as fast as you possibly can, because the opportunity, forget the net zero benefits. Obviously, we understand that with COP26 coming up. From a financial perspective, moving quickly opens up the opportunity to access reutilization revenues. And when you are financing, the most important thing to look for, whether you're doing that on balance sheet or off balance sheet, i.e. relying on external funders to fund the carbon capture as a project, as a separate project financed entity, or perhaps using a finance leasing model where you are taking responsibility for how the equipment works, its operation, but you are leasing the equipment from a technology provider. Whatever model you're using, the cash flow is key. And what we have now is the ability to draw on these spike in demand for both food and beverage grade CO2 and industrial grade CO2. Everybody will understand in the last few weeks that CO2 is actually an incredibly valuable commodity, but it is a commodity that will be cannibalized. So the faster that industry moves to install carbon capture equipment to then enable the reutilization of that CO2 in industry, to enable it to be sold at full value, the more their project is bankable. And that doesn't mean we don't need permanent storage. We absolutely do. But this is a way of moving now so that when the permanent storage is available, actually the equipment to capture the carbon has largely been installed and amortized. So as a business, you're actually looking at this as an opportunity to create value rather than as a cost center.
I mean, great point, Helena. And I think the key thing, you already hit the nail on its head, which is off-balance sheet financing. And this is what this is about. Carbon capture and storage as a service is all about off-balance sheet. How can we bring the technology, implementation, execution, all of that in a package and make it easily available for adoption at prices that make business sense? I mean, bringing them to something as low as £1 per ton cost that the industry would be paying in terms of decarbonizing the site, ensuring the CO2 is transported or is utilized and or it's stored in a very orderly fashion. I think that sort of very pertinent question brings me to, again, to Siri to actually ask a question about, some of the industry, they have this fear that there will not be enough storage capacity. So you've said something about storage capacity coming online in 2024, but do you think that there will be enough storage capacity for the industry within the European region?
I think it's a good question, Aniruddha, and it can very well be that the storage capacity will be a bottleneck at that stage. I think to date, it's been the main objection against CCS is, of course, the business model. So where is the carbon price? And as we've seen, and we've all seen, it's been really accelerating over the last few years, and we see that direction continue. But it's of course a crossover. Where will this meet the cost of carbon capturing and storing? But we are getting close, with new technology and also deploying technology at larger scale. We bring down cost, and at the same time, governments in Europe and also other places in the world, they pushed the carbon price up. So some European countries are already approaching 200 euro per ton. And then we're talking that it's really more beneficial or cost effective to capture and store versus letting it go. But yes, when you see this evolve, you can easily see that the storage is going to be a bottleneck to really capture all the carbon that the world needs us to capture.
If I may, Annie, sorry.
Go ahead, Helena. Yeah.
I just want to try and show the economics a little bit from a project financing perspective of where we are on carbon capture now, because I think there are a lot of misunderstandings in industry as to whether or not this can actually is actually a cost-effective decision now. So let me give an example because it's easier to work with examples. We're working on a biomass plant at the moment in the southwest of the UK. And in that area, there is not an indigenous source of CO2, not a single indigenous source of CO2 for the food and beverage industry. That means for poultry processing, pig processing, beverage manufacturing, food packaging, not a single source. All of it is imported. And over the last 6 weeks, we've seen the CO2 price go from somewhere around 100, 120, 150 pounds a ton, which is already significantly higher than the cost of capture, at least with a carbon clean solution. We've seen it spike to £1,000 a ton. So what that tells you is there is an immediate security of supply business need for high quality CO2 that can be met rather than by producing grey CO2. It can be met from producing it from biomass, for example, or other low carbon sources, which create a negative emission scenario, which may also attract carbon credits in due course. I'm sure we'll come on to that. So we already have a revenue stream there that is significantly more valuable than the actual cost of capture, which depending on the inputs, as we know, is somewhere between 30 and 60 pounds a ton now, before we even see innovation. So this is a great business opportunity for companies to act on.
Interesting. I mean, I should probably remind the viewers and other people who've joined us that you can log into Hoven platform and you can post the questions there. We're absolutely taking questions, whatever you want to ask. We're here to answer the questions. I think you raised a very important point, Helena, about negative emissions and offsets. How do you see them as far as the financial instrument is concerned? I mean, where do you see them placed, and when do you see them becoming really viable? And moving on from there to Siri, I think it's very interesting that we recently heard that Microsoft had joined the Northern Lights project. If you could talk a bit more about what attracted them to the project, and how do you bring more partners like Microsoft to these projects?
Siri, do you want to go first, or? So on the carbon credit front, I think what we need to see is a lot more clarity from government in the UK. So things were much more clear when we were part of the EU ETS. We're now entering the brave frontier of the UK ETS. And I can't honestly say, even though I spend all day working in this industry, that I understand how we could accredit CO2 permanent capture from a biomass plant in order to be able to deliver that negative emission potential to clients. And so if we don't have that clarity on the measurement, verification, and accreditation process under the UK ETS, then it's very difficult to ask a financier to actually take into account the revenue from the sale of such credits in the revenue stack of an overall project to deliver carbon capture. It's impossible for them to do that. So there is just not enough transparency on how that is going to evolve, what the credits are going to look like, in order to then to be able to value that in a financial model.
Very, very pertinent point. Siri?
Yep. So you asked me about Microsoft, and I'm not really the right person to speak on behalf of Microsoft, but we read in the news that that they are aiming for being carbon negative, or not just net zero ambitions, but actually negative footprint on carbon. And I guess although one driver is also that Equinor is a large customer of Microsoft, and I think it's part of the deal between Microsoft and Northern Lights that they will work on the digitalization of the whole value chain to support the cost reduction journey, to make the value chain really efficient. So I think that is one driver. Then it is this negative carbon journey that Microsoft is on. You can easily see that, yes, we need to capture all the carbon that we have from emission points, but we might even capture carbon from the air and then store it in storage opportunities like the Northern Light or others. So I think it's probably a combination, but it's this is from more from the public information rather than inside information to that story.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, Microsoft, that they've actually said that they're going to offset all the historical carbon emissions as well. And that brings to the point about the need for negative emissions. So I think if a biomass industry is using biomass or involved in the biomass chain, I think there's a great opportunity there to be able to say, well, here is a potential off-taker that's going to off-take all those credits. But I think we do need some kind of certification mechanism, some kind of clear government guidance on how this would actually work. We've got a couple of questions coming in, so I do want to take a couple of them. I think there's a question here that talks about what's the role of a non-pipeline CO2 transport networks, for example, road, ships, rail, in driving the carbon capture as a service opportunity. And yeah, I mean, they're saying it looks well suited to modular carbon capture. Siri, Helena?
Sure, I can take that one. Fully support that. It's a much more flexible solution than a piped solution. So it's easier to pick up the CO2 from wherever it is and bring it either by trucks or ships or anything, and also to scale up. So you can start carefully or gradually with capturing small volumes of carbon, maybe by modular capture, as Aniruddha has described with the new next generation technology, and then scale it up both with more ships, more trucks, or more modules on the capture side. So it fits very well, I think, and it's quite important to get this going.
Can I just add to that, Annie?
Yep.
So I think from a financing perspective, it's really important to consider the transport costs of CO2 that's being captured upfront, because when you look at the cost stack in a financing, the transportation of CO2 is quite a significant a cost associated with monetizing the opportunity. And that's not just in terms of transport of the CO2 to a permanent storage facility. It might be the utilization of the CO2 on site in, say, building material manufacture, but then the transportation of that product to market all adds to the cost of the overall project, or the transportation of the CO2 to the end user in a liquefied form. So that means on-site liquefaction and the transport costs associated with that. So what's really important is that you understand that your project boundary, when you're looking for financing, is not just the equipment itself that's actually doing the capture. It's actually getting the product to market or the CO2 to final storage. And all of that has to be taken into account in looking at the rate of return for an external financer.
Oh, I think it's a great question, and that's really where some of the anxieties of the industry actually come out, because the government, at least in the UK, is talking about cluster sequencing, which means not all the clusters will be available or will be ready or built at the same point of time. But with the business model of carbon capture as a service and transport and storage as a service, those emitters who are at a port site, who are close to a port site, can very well think about getting started right now, because there is a benefit of getting started early on in this process. It's not a perfect process; it's a fast developing market, so you do need to sort of consider the fact that it'll take 2 to 3 years for you to actually come up with a plan that's implementable, fundable, financeable, and then deployable for any industrial site. There's a question here that talks about what other revenue streams do you see today to bridge the gap until large-scale CCS is available. I think the panel already sort of talked a bit about that, which is either a utilization opportunity on-site, close to a site, selling in the local markets, or a transport and storage as a service. If you are close to a port, then we can sort of come in and we can have a conversation about how do we transport this carbon dioxide and then take it to a storage location. In fact, transportation by ships, I think, is going to be even more important, because this is about kind of democratizing the assets, existing assets. The storage asset is a big asset, takes a lot of time. I think I could probably talk about a third example as well, where there is a lot of utilization. So again, Carbon Clean is providing its modular technology to a plant in Sweden, where CO2 will be captured and it will be mixed with hydrogen produced from offshore wind to produce carbon neutral fuel for the shipping industry. If we have announced it publicly, it's a product called Liquid Wind, and it's very, very interesting because it's looking to decarbonize two sectors. One is an emission source in Sweden, and at the same point of time, a second industry, which is shipping. It's very hard to abate. And they're facing a lot of pressure, and they're ready to pay an interesting price to be able to achieve certain level of decarbonization between 25 and 30. So they're just getting started, but I think there are a lot of opportunities there. There is a very interesting business model about sustainable aviation fuel as well, which Helena is working on. And that's the benefit of knowing something in the background. Do we quickly want to talk about that, Helena?
In terms of SAF?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that it really depends on which SAF technologies you're talking about. But the e-fuels opportunity, e-kerosene, which is combining hydrogen and CO2 in order to be able to be used in traditional aircraft engines rather than having to move towards fully hydrogen planes, is an enormous opportunity, because there is obviously a regime in the UK. The government supports, through the Department for Transport, the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation, and certificates, development RTFCs are available for aviation fuel, which means that there is a great deal more government support through this market mechanism for low carbon aviation fuels. So that's one driver. The other driver is that it's just very difficult to find low carbon fuels for aviation anywhere in the world right now, other than from, say, palm oil, which most airlines want to stay clear of. And so what we're seeing is a lot of innovation happening in the aviation space towards e-kerosene and the role of CO2 in transitioning to a lower carbon scenario. So yeah, it's a very, very lucrative market led by airlines seeking to procure low carbon fuel.
Very interesting. We have a question here that talks about, and someone wants to know about how can the fully modular solutions adopt to different type of flue gases, that may contain some impurities. I can take that question. I mean, the way you adapt the fully modular solution, what we call is all in a box solution, is to have a pre-treatment unit sitting inside the box, which will remove and which will deal with the kind of impurities you generally see, which is SOx, NOx, soot, ash, dust, heavy metals coming in the flue gas. I mean, at Carbon Clean, we've had the experience of working on very clean but lean gas, which is the example Siri talked about, which is Technology Center Mongstad. CO2 concentration was really low at the CHP, which was about 3.3%. And then we've had the experience of working with cement plants with the likes of Cemex and Lafarge-Holcim, where there are other challenges with the flue gas quality, and then working with steel plant with Tata Steel, and then of course going all the way to about 50% in the flue gas. So the simple answer to that is you actually provision for any spike in the flue gases. It's also important to think about what a future mix may look like, because some of the industry is now already thinking about how could they co-fire some of their existing units on hydrogen. So your flue gas concentration, which you're thinking about, oh, I have this and I need to capture CO2 from this, would actually change quite a lot in future, may change quite a lot in future, depending upon where we land up with the price of hydrogen. So, a couple of things to actually think about, but nothing that's not solvable. Siri, I have a specific question for you, where someone is asking that the University of Edinburgh in the UK, they've come out with a research that there is no shortage of CO2 storage. So they're trying to seek a clarification around the capacity bottleneck.
Yeah, so totally agree that there's a lot of potential for storage in the world, but it's only a potential. So the storage needs to be developed, and it's just the speed of development that can be, create a bottleneck, or will probably create a bottleneck. So if Wood Mackenzie's report is right, we need about 3.5 gigaton of CO2 storage capacity by 2030. And that means that we need to develop a number of Northern Light projects every week, starting today. And we don't see that yet. So that's where the bottleneck is coming in. So it's all about catching up speed, and to catch up speed, we need the government support, like the Northern Light. The Norwegian government picked up 80% of the cost of development of that. So we need to see more of that. Otherwise, it's going to be too much of a burden for the business to really scale up as quickly as needed.
I think there's one other really important thing that I think a lot of governments forget, and that is that the storage is not always where you need it for the CO2 production. So we do a lot of work in the Thames estuary on their hydrogen route map, and obviously the linkage between hydrogen and CO2 is clear, as Annie mentioned, not just in the context of blue hydrogen production, but also co-firing of ammonia and CO2 capture on industrial facilities. And there is no, well, with the exception of a very small amount, there is no geological storage anywhere in the Thames estuary. The only option is to ship it to the northwest. The same is true for the industrial cluster in South Wales. There is very limited geological storage available there. And so it's not just that we have to accelerate the provision of storage, as Siri said, it's that we will always have a situation where we have to create a value chain for the transportation of CO2 to storage where it exists, when the CO2, I mean, the Thames Estuary is the largest producer of CO2 in the entire country, even though it's not an industrial cluster, and it has nowhere to store that CO2. So we have to create a whole value chain around that. And that takes time, even if you've got the permanent storage available in a regulated asset.
These are, I'm sure, like our viewers and the people on the platform are listening to these questions. Just after this session, that is the Secretary of State, Minister Kwasi Kwarteng, would be speaking. So I would encourage people to post the questions to him. I think it's a very good lead, and people are taking notes about it. And I fully agree with Siri that, you know, there is a lot of potential, but you need investments right now to be able to sort of develop them, for these assets to be ready for utilization when the time comes. It's a bit of a chicken and egg, but I think you have to get started somewhere. And to be honest, that's really the reason why we believe modularization, or full modularization, you know, nothing on site, full modularization, equipment on the site, connections, everything, in 4 weeks, you get a carbon capture plant. I think that's the way to go. Because if you think about the scale up ambition, the global capacity of capturing carbon dioxide today is only 40 million tons per year. We need to scale up. If we have to scale up to, by 2030, we need to scale up to even 1 billion tons of CO2 capture and storage. 3.5 billion tons is too far. Even if you have to achieve a third of that ambition, we're going to need a 50 times the scale up in next 9 years in the capacity. If you look at world's total installation capacity today, which is, you know, all the large plants that could potentially be installed, we're probably at around 2 million tons per year of capture installation capacity today. So in next 9 years, that's only 20 million. Let's be very, very positive, and it's another 40 million. Even then, in 2030, we'll only be able to get to about 80 million tons of installed capacity. We'll not reach 1 billion tons. We'll only reach there if this becomes a really standard model. You know, something like a compressor. You go, you order, you install 4 weeks, and you have a carbon capture machine sitting at your side. Only then you will be able to achieve the level of scale up that's required for carbon capture and storage to remain really relevant for a 1.5 degree scenario. There's a question here that talks about the current barriers of use for the capture carbon dioxide in the industrial carbonation and drinks process. I mean, Helena, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so there's no technological barrier to the upgrade of the CO2 that can be captured from technologies like Carbon Clean to upgrade it to food grade. It is an additional piece of equipment. It is something that the distributors of CO2 around the country, the food and beverage industry, are very used to using. It's not a technology issue. It is a little bit of an additional cost, and so that obviously has to be factored into the financing arrangements for the overall solution. There is, I think, also worth mentioning a perception issue, which has absolutely nothing to do with chemicals or health and safety, but has everything to do with perception. But I'm really pleased to say that what I'm hearing in the market now is, once upon a time, capturing CO2 from, say, anaerobic digestion facilities or wastewater treatment facilities, which do produce a lot of CO2 and often produce that CO2 close to industry that utilizes it. Previously, there was sort of a perception that taking CO2 from that kind of feedstock and using it in the food and beverage industry was somehow not what a consumer would want. CO2 is CO2 is CO2. It doesn't really matter where it comes from. So that perception issue is changing now, and I'm really happy to see projects coming through our pipeline in that context. Because what we need to always remember here is that we have, in the UK and across Europe, you have industrial clusters, and the clusters have to work as a whole in order to optimize the financial structuring of these deals. So if you look at a CO2 capture plant in isolation, rather than looking at it as part of a cluster, then you get a suboptimal solution. And so it would be a crazy situation to have a producer of CO2 from a waste treatment facility sitting next to a greenhouse and sitting next to a soft drink manufacturer, and those users of CO2 saying, no, I'm going to import my CO2 from hundreds of miles away because I'm not sure about the feedstock. So that's where it's not really about facts, it's about perception.
Very interesting. Siri, do you want to maybe touch quickly upon the quality of CO2 required for storage, and should people be thinking about what's if there are any restrictions, any suggestions on the quality of CO2 there?
Well, yeah, I can comment on that. But first, I'd like to add to Helena's point on, and also to the question on revenue streams for CO2 capture and storage. And I think sort of the market perception is growing that the general footprint of the products, regardless of what the product is, the general CO2 footprint is more and more important for the consumers when they purchase. So there's probably going to be more and more clear that there's a market premium for products that's produced with as little CO2 emission as possible, and that is a clear revenue stream. So it's a clear support for the utilization case that Helena was describing, and it's also basically for any kind of consumer goods that you can think about that you capture and store. It is also part of that business case. When it comes to the quality of the CO2 for storage, it can take many different shapes and forms. So you see that, but it's also technology that's available. You can store it mineralized, or you can store it as a liquid or gas as part of water or what have you. So I think that technology is developed, it's available, and so that's not going to be a barrier to the solutions.
Very interesting. We have a very interesting question here that talks about the, we can expand and talk a bit about the project financing and the considerations of different business structures or different business models, and how do they sort of apply on a wide variety of industries? It's a very big question.
A small question. Do you want me to have a go?
Yeah, go ahead.
So maybe if I talk about it in an industrial context, because I think it's probably helpful to draw a distinction between large-scale blue hydrogen projects and the business model and the project financing model for Acorn or HyNet or Teesworks, which is very dependent on the government acting on some form of tariff to support permanent storage, because there's not a revenue stream in that situation. There's too much CO2 being produced in order for a reutilization scenario, and that would actually crash the price of food grade CO2 if you did it that way. So I'm just going to focus on the industrial carbon capture project financing model. The key thing that we look at once we've identified whether there is a suitable revenue stream for the project is risk allocation. And so what we see in the market is that there are models coming through that are being financed by banks like SocGen, BNP Paribas, which are essentially finance leases. Equipment is leased. There's a residual value allocated to that piece of equipment, and the lessee can choose to retain that equipment or to end the lease at the end of its life. That is in stark contrast to a true project financing model where a special purpose vehicle owns all of the equipment and all of the rights associated with delivery of the carbon capture solution and the on sale of the CO2 or disposal of the CO2 and any other valuable products that are part of the overall project structure. And the key difference between the two is risk. So in a leasing scenario, the party that is leasing this carbon capture equipment is taking all of the risk of then distributing the CO2 for value or finding the revenue stack to support the leasing of the equipment. They may not have responsibility for the actual operation and maintenance of the equipment. That might be part of the leasing offer, but the actual monetization is their problem. And that is not something that is a core competency of the industrial players that are utilizing the CO2 capture equipment. So you're making a decision there, you're going to take on quite a lot of risk. Whereas in a project financing model, the funders are specialist funders in that world. The rights and undertakings that are associated with obtaining the revenue stream and maintaining the equipment and everything that makes it possible to actually utilize the CO2, that is all the responsibility of the special purpose vehicle and its funders. And so from the industrial perspective, that means that they are actually allocating the risk to the party that's best able to bear it in that situation, as well as not having to cover the upfront funding cost associated with the equipment itself. So that's why we tend to see a lot of positive noises coming out of industry for a project financing model, less so the leasing model, because they're concerned about absorbing that risk. And then there's just the natural predisposition of industry to want to fund on a corporate basis, on a balance sheet basis. But I think, that industry is very stressed right now. So being able to find an external funder for these solutions is becoming a necessity rather than just a nice option to have.
Interesting. Siri, yeah, I think you want to make a point there.
No. What were you thinking of, Aniruddha?
Well, no, I mean, just in terms of the financing model. So I think Helena touched upon the leasing model and the SPV model. From your perspective, would there be any models that you would like to suggest as far as the transport and the storage element is concerned, for especially for dispersed sites?
I think that's it's difficult to say. The one demonstration project that we have is basically the setup of the system itself is pretty much covered by the government and the major partners. So it's Equinor, Shell, and Total. So it's large and solid companies with lots of funds, so they are able to do this. And then it's about running. We still need to see where that is going, but it's a tariff based. So again, the risk is off the customers, and it's onto the hands of these large professional players. And I think that's the beauty and the flexibility of that model. I think you will see different models when you have pipelines. We have a Humber area as an example of that, where we really collaborate with all the industrial partners in a cluster and find the model and build the infrastructure around the partnership for that. And then we take, of course, a certain role in establishing or tying the partners together, and then establishing the storage solution, which is again piped and offshore. But I think you will find different models and different partnerships and collaboration depending on where you are in the world and how it's positioned versus storage solutions and opportunities and the proximity, etc. So yeah.
I mean, I'm quite aware of the time, but also want to maybe try to work towards a wrap up. We know that Secretary of State is going to speak immediately after this panel. So if you had one wish, what would you ask for?
I think Siri should go first.
Oh, thank you. No, it's really to have the support. There's important decisions coming up shortly, and prioritization of the different clusters in the UK. I think we all wish that they should prioritize it all and go full speed and really get this going to form the platform and really show that the UK is going to be the front leader in this establishing this industry as they set out to several years ago. So together with Norwegian, of course, but I think that would be my wish.
Helena?
I have multiple wishes, but I'll try and prioritize. I would like clarity around the UK ETS. I would like it to be incredibly simple, and for the UK to lead the world in this respect, to credit and trade in permanently stored CO2 in a variety of different forms, whether that's in materials or it's in permanent storage offshore. So that whether I'm a small AD plant operator that wants to capture CO2, or I am a very large industrial player, or I am a blue hydrogen project, I have absolute clarity as to how I go about trading in the UK ETS, so that we can actually get that to become a very liquid market with a variety of different participants. And if we can do that, then we will start to see so many other players come into the market seeking to create value from what is otherwise considered a waste.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining me on this panel today. Very much looking forward to the minister's address after this. We all are very clear on what the opportunities and priorities should be. And I do want to thank Carbon Capture and Storage Association for giving us the opportunity to come here and talk about what we're doing, which is carbon capture as a service. Thank you very much.